unbelievably good skills in tech matters to try and help him get the right camera to work.
Yes, I think one of your team may be assisting with that. Just to allow you a few minutes to sort that out.
Right.
I think if you go down to, if you go down to that, no, do you want? Let me try. I think I can do it.
Brilliant. IT expert.
Very good. Okay.
We'll just allow Mr. Village to return to his seat.
Yeah, I'm back. Thank you.
You're back, good. You can add IT to your many skills on your CV, Mr. Village. Okay, Mr. Robson, would you like to commence?
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, Mr. Best.
Morning.
Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. As I've said to the other witnesses, if at any point you can't, obviously please do tell me, and I can re-put any questions in case it drops out. The weather in North Lancashire is a lot better than it was yesterday when the rain was affecting internet, so fingers crossed we should be unaffected. I want to start looking at how we go about assessing need so that we can set down some ground rules and areas of agreement for the more detailed questions. And you set this out in your section 3 in your proof of evidence. And you tell us at 3.5 that there's no formal prescribed methodology and that we look to Secretary of State appeal decisions for guidance as to how we assess need. Yes?
Yes, and just sort of evolution over time, yes.
Yes, that's right. And there's no formal policy, is there?
No.
And indeed no PPG guidance, so it is all taken from experience and from the appeal decisions.
Yes.
Thank you. And we look at quantitative and qualitative need. And you set out a description of quantitative need at 3.7. And the part I've highlighted is that it's a need for a new crematorium to serve a community where the demand for cremations generated in that community cannot adequately be met by the available cremation slots of the existing crematoria in that area. And that's very much the starting point, isn't it? That's the high level definition of quantitative need.
Yes.
So we could say that when we get into slightly more detail, we look at whether there is a population within an MDC or an NCA, and therefore the deaths and therefore the cremations that would be able to sustain a proposed crematorium. And we agree in this case there's no issue with viability of the proposal. There are the deaths and there are the cremations available to support the business.
Two points really. I focus on deaths and cremations rather than population, but also perhaps more importantly in my need assessment, I'm basing it upon as a starting point the actual number of cremations that have been undertaken at the existing crematoria and the best forecast we can get of the number for Barnaby done as the proposed crematoria, rather than using the natural catchment area as a starting point.
We'll get on to forecasting from actuals and forecasting from modelling, because as you set out yesterday in Chief, you do a bit of both, don't you? In sections 9 you deal with actuals, and in section 10 you deal with modelling from the NCAs.
Yes, section 9 is the needs section, and section 10 is the impact and rebalancing section.
Yes.
And I just you did say that my need assessment was based upon the NCAs, and that isn't correct. It's based upon the existing number of cremations undertaken at each existing crematoria. But it is, you are correct in your follow-up that I do go on to use NCAs in section 10.
Just to be clear, it wasn't a statement about your assessment. It was how one goes to look at quantitative need, and we can start by looking at whether there are or there will be sufficient cremations to support a potential new business, and we're agreed that in this case there will be.
Yes.
And you said that you don't look at population, you look at deaths and cremations. That's right, you do focus on deaths and cremations, but when you look at the impact, your section 10 and the modelling, that is looking at populations, because from population you can get deaths and levels of cremations, can't you?
The death data is provided
at the output level.
At the output level, so I don't need to start with population and then calculate a death rate. I can get that from the source material.
Okay. And then we look at whether there are the cremations, the level of the number of cremations that the proposed development will take to relieve any overtrading at nearby facilities.
Yes.
And that is based in large part, if we look at your 3.15, on the proximity being the main driver in choice.
Proximity is the main driver in choice, and I use that in section 10 when modelling impact and rebalancing. Section 9 isn't based on that. It's based upon what the existing crematoria undertake.
Yes, and projecting that forward.
Yes.
Well, yes. It's based in part, isn't it, on what the existing crematorium undertake, because you do some degree of modelling when, and we'll get to this, but when you look at Barnby Dun and Barnby Moor.
Correct. Obviously, if there were no recent or proposed developments, I would just simply look at the existing based upon the number of cremations actually undertaken. But because I can't do that in this case, I've introduced an element of modelling.
And then when we look, you set out the link between quantitative and qualitative, so that if you are able to relieve overtrading, one benefit of that relief is the opportunity to improve the quality of your service, and we'll define quality next.
Yes.
And improving the quality of your service can be increasing your slot length, for want of a better phrase, in your core period.
Yes.
And the slot length, as I think you and Mr. Mitchell agree, the gold standard, Mr. Mitchell's term, is 60 minutes.
Yes.
But the objective, and we can go there if we need, but I don't think we need to, because that must be agreed. The objective of the Iccm charter is 45 minutes.
Yes, the Iccm charter says, I think, a minimum of 40
yes.
to 45 minutes. It does actually say service times and not slots. Now, to my mind, the service time is the period of time that you're actually in the crematorium and doesn't take into account coming and going. But I appreciate there's some ambiguity in that.
There is, and I think it's an ambiguity within the document, isn't it? Because service isn't defined.
Yes.
Yes. But there is the appeal decision we went to at earlier in the week, the Wheatings appeal decision, which is H19. Do you have that?
I will do in a second.
Sorry.
Yes, I have it.
And at paragraph 14. Do you see there? The inspector, the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Management document charter for the bereaved sets out an objective for a minimum service time of 40 to 45 minutes to allow funerals to arrive and depart without seeing other funerals and avoid delay because of the late arrival of other funerals. While the appellant intends to offer 1 hour services, as currently do 3 or 4 of the nearest crematoria, the length is not included as a right or objective, and therefore the inspector considers a service time of 45 minutes is therefore a reasonable assumption when assessing capacity. So the interpretation there is service to include beginning and end of the slot.
That was the inspector's interpretation. Yes. I mean, from a personal perspective, it's not one I agree with, because I think that the Iccm would have specified slots if they'd really meant it. But I appreciate your point that services isn't defined in the document, and that's why I said initially that it is slightly ambiguous.
If we go to the document F17, and I want to be clear that as I think Mr. Village said last week, barristers don't have opinions. We just put what we're told. Mr. Mitchell's answer was that an hour was the gold standard, but it's just to see where the if there is a silver standard or if there is another acceptable level. F17, page 47. Are you there?
Almost.
Sorry, I won't rush you along. I know it's difficult with the electronic documents.
Yeah, I'm there.
Are you there, ma'am? It's charter targets and it's E and F. E is charter members should increase the minimum time allocated for funeral services to 40 or 45 minutes wherever possible. And we don't see any definition there of services. You see that, Mr.
Yes, no, I agree.
And then at F, the burial or cremation ceremony should be considered a highly individual or unimportant occasion. Each funeral should ideally arrive and depart without seeing other funerals. Neither should they be delayed by the late arrival of other funerals. To help achieve this standard, a minimum service time of 40 or 45 minutes should be an objective. So if the 40 to 45 minute service time is an objective to enable each funeral to arrive and depart without seeing other funerals, it would suggest that 40 to 45 minutes is the slot time.
It would suggest that's the minimum time. Yes. Well, no, sorry. That's the interpretation of the Wheating inspector. I still consider the fact that it uses the word service time to mean a service, but I accept the interpretation that the inspector came to at Wheating. I would just recall that Mr. Mitchell considered that to be an outlier as an appeal decision. I think that was his word. Yeah, I still think that from a planning point of view, you should be looking to achieve good quality, and good quality is an hour, and that's what we should be looking to provide.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, I think that was agreed by Mr. Mitchell. It was just the flexibility. That was the gold standard in his phrase. So there are other acceptable levels of quality provision, which the Charter sets out in its targets.
Well, it suggests a minimum, and I would hope that we're looking to do better than their minimum.
But even a minimum would be within a quality standard, because it's not unacceptable, is it?
It's not below that threshold, no.
Thank you. Back to your 3.7, please. And you talk there, then you talk about Rose Hill Crematorium to the east of Doncaster, recognised to be operating at a level above its capacity, arising from which there is a need to improve the community, to provide the community in Doncaster area with additional provision to relieve the operating levels at Rose Hill. So slot length would be one of the improvements, and waiting time would be one of the other qualitative improvements that can be made when quantitative relief is provided.
Correct. Yes, there should be less need to wait for a cremation slot if there is better quantitative provision.
And then you go on to explain qualitative need, which I think we've discussed, and then your 3.14 and 3.15, you deal with convenient catchment areas.
Yes.
And this is the 30-minute Cortege drive time.
Yes.
And you accept that the 30-minute Cortege drive time is a metric of qualitative provision that's been accepted by inspectors in various other appeals.
Yes.
And if we go to B13, which is the need statement for the application, and page 13 of that document, paragraph 3.52. Now, as I understand, I'm correct, aren't I, that you didn't write this need statement?
I didn't write it, no.
Did you have any involvement at all in its production?
It was prepared by our team.
Your team.
The department. It's not my team, our team. I'm in the same team, and I did read it, but I didn't write it.
Did you have any oversight of it or any signing off of the document?
I didn't sign it off. I obviously made comments when I read it.
So you provided feedback on the document that led into the final version?
Correct.
Thank you. But if we look at 3.52, we see there under quantitative considerations, the proposed facilities catchment area and the 30-minute maximum drive time for catchment areas was used in the need assessments for the proposals at Calverton, Camborne, Lac Dennis, Swanwick, I assume, Holstead and Great Glen. Those are all appeal decisions, aren't they?
They are.
And the 30-minute drive time then is listed there in a document you reviewed as number 1 on the list of ways of assessing quantitative performance and qualitative delivery.
Yes.
So I say quantitative performance and qualitative delivery because it's the quantitative in terms of how many people you can get into
yes.
the 30-minute drive time, and quality because that's the level that we're told bereaved families would like.
Yes, that's correct. It took me a little bit to understand the question, but I think that's right. The 30 minutes is I don't know how it's derived in the first place, but it's underpinned from a qualitative perspective.
Yes.
By survey evidence that longer journey times are more distressing or stressful to the bereaved, and therefore you try and limit it to 30 minutes.
That's right, and the inspector hopefully has the reference from yesterday, but you give in your IPB1 the Westerly survey.
Yes. JPB, I think.
JPB, sorry, I changed your first name. I have that at starting at electronic page 77 of 92. And it's the third question on page 879 of 92. How long do you think is a reasonable travel time for funeral cortege to travel from your home to the nearest crematorium? And we see there over 90% saying less than 30 minutes.
Correct. Yeah, about 93%.
So the qualitative expectation of bereaved families is less than a 30-minute drive from home to the nearest crematorium. Yes?
Yes.
And the quantitative assessment is how many people will a new crematorium deliver that quality of service to.
Sorry, can you just say that again?
I know, sorry, I want to get this absolute. So the quality standard.
Yeah, I think we're okay on the quality.
It was less than 30 minutes. And then the quantitative assessment is how many bereaved families will benefit from a less than 30-minute drive time as a result of the new development.
That is an approach. However, where I've looked at this from a geographical basis is in chapter 10 of my evidence, where I've based it on natural catchment areas. I think it's perhaps worth going to figure 10.2a, which is on page 58.
Yep.
So earlier you took me to a reference to the definition of convenience, and effectively the dark shaded area, anywhere within that dark shaded area, the proposed site will be more convenient than any other. And therefore I've looked at that area rather than the area within the continuous red line, which is the 30-minute drive time. Now, with the exception of one area to the northeast of the proposal, all of that natural catchment area, the dark shaded area, is within 30 minutes. So almost exclusively, the population of the natural catchment area will find the appeal proposal both the most convenient, and it will be within a less than 30-minute drive time.
But you don't, however, go on to assess how many of those people would already have a crematorium within a 30-minute drive time.
No, I don't. I think it's fair to say that in this case, I don't think it'll be very many people. Certainly not a significant proportion of the overall population or number of deaths within the relevant catchment areas. I haven't based the case on that at all. Essentially, in this case, whilst I'm sure there will be some people who are brought into a newly served in effect within 30 minutes, and I think Mr. Hodgson does quantify it at something like 20,000. My case is based upon the effect of relieving the over trading, particularly in the Western Arc. So it's choice and relieving effect.
Do you accept, though, that how many people are brought within a 30-minute catchment for the first time is a material consideration?
Well, it can be a relevant indicator of need, and I accepted that in one of the paragraphs in section 3 that you took me to earlier. Now that tends to apply primarily to rural areas. simply because most of the existing crematoria are, whilst not necessarily in an urban area, relatively close to an urban area, and therefore almost inevitably the parts of the country which are more than a 30-minute drive time are rural. We're not in that type of location because the Western Arc is urban in character, and whilst the eastern side is much more rural, the site is effectively located between the urban area of Doncaster and that Western Arc urban area. So in effect, we're looking at a largely urban catchment.
Thank you. And then finally, just on the assessing of need, we use the 80% practical core capacity in the peak month as guidance on the level when a crematorium would be most able to make qualitative improvements.
Yes.
So it doesn't become impossible to make qualitative improvements when you're operating at 81%, nor does it become inevitable that you will make qualitative improvements when you're operating at 79%.
No, clearly, as the number beside the percentage symbol increases, then slowly but surely, the problems of on the operational side and the quality of service will or are likely to reduce. It isn't suddenly dropping off a cliff. No. It's bit by bit, but ultimately we have to come to some sort of judgment. And if we didn't have a percentage, then that would be unstructured, and we could all come up with a different figure, frankly. So having an 80% figure gives it some sort of framework.
Don't worry, I'm not daft enough to argue with somebody who clearly likes statistics about unstructured assessment. I think that way madness lies. But we're agreed that the 80. I think we're agreed, aren't we, that the 80% is not a cliff face, a cliff edge, but it is the accepted and agreed point certainly between my client and yours, at which it becomes more or less difficult, depending on which side of the line you lie.
Yes.
Good. Direct cremations we'll deal with. Well, let's briefly, when we're looking at peak practical core capacity, that requires you to make an assessment of the number of slots that are available during the peak period. Well, firstly, it allows you must identify the peak period, but I think that's agreed at around 10 till 3 o'clock.
Yes, we've got slight differences. Sorry, Mr. Mitchell and I've got slight differences, but I don't think it makes any difference, certainly not in aggregate terms. No,
this is the statistician and the planner in you, isn't it, who wants something precise but is happy to accept judgment. I don't think it makes a material difference, does it?
It doesn't make a material difference.
And then once you've decided on your peak hours, you assess the number of slots that go into that peak period.
Yes.
And that then gives you your capacity from which you can assess your practical peak core capacity percentage when you look at the number of cremations.
Yes, I refer to it as factor capacity. Mr. Mitchell refers to it as practical capacity, but it's the same thing. It's so effectively the number, it's the capacity based upon core slots.
Yeah. And then you have your number of cremations within your actuals or your number of cremations within your modelled MDC, NCA calculation. And you're essentially
when you're saying actuals, I'm assuming you're meaning the actual numbers at crematoria.
Yes, sorry, I think you use actuals on your paragraph, your section 9.
Yes, I did. I just wanted.
So actuals, I'm taking as the reported number of cremations in the annual report that's in the core documents. So you're essentially trying to squeeze either of those figures into your peak capacity, and that's what gives you your the percentage that we've been working on throughout of your peak practical core capacity.
Correct.
Now, if the number of cremations can be reduced in part by the number of direct cremations that are being done.
Yes.
Because the direct cremation doesn't need to go into your peak slots.
Correct.
So if you have a higher number of direct cremations, you are trying to find core space for fewer cremations than you would be with a lower number of direct cremations.
Yes, if you have a consistent number of overall cremations and the proportion of direct cremations increases, then it is easier to achieve the traditional cremations within the core slots.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Lathbury yesterday accepted that the market is changing and that direct cremations are becoming more of a product that is used more and more by bereaved families.
He certainly said it was part of the
Yes.
established offer now, and I agree with that. I think there's an issue about what proportion it will sort of peak at, but it is certainly, and I would agree with him entirely. It is part of the offer to the public.
Yes, and equally with the hybrids, that is a relatively new product for bereaved families.
Yes.
And so there is an element of judgment involved in what that will look like and demand for those products in the future. And there's a difference in what you say, 14%, Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Hodgson, 20% by 2034.
Yes, there is a difference.
But whether it's 14 or 20%, the quality expectations of the market will be changing into the future, won't they?
So I don't understand what you mean when you say quality expectations of the market.
You will have fewer people that necessarily want a 1 hour slot with a 45-minute service, because there are a number of people, increasing number of people, who want either a pure direct cremation, i.e. nothing at all at the crematorium, or want a shorter slot period because they have that's the type of service that they wish.
Yes, I've obviously estimated the direct cremations and hybrid at just under 4% at the moment, and forecast that would go up to 14%. So yes, I agree with you in that context.
And it's judgment, isn't it? At that stage, it's judgment about what it's going to look like.
That's correct. Nobody knows for sure.
No. Cremation rates. Now, these are important to assessing capacity, because the cremation rate allows you to assess the number of cremations from the number of deaths each year.
Yes.
And if the cremation rate goes up, then the demand for slots goes up.
Yes.
And if the demand for slots goes up, but the number of available slots doesn't, then the peak practical peak core capacity will go up. It's crying out for an acronym, that, isn't it?
It is. If the number of cremations goes up and the number of core slots remains the same, then it means that the quality of service offered is more difficult, because it becomes tougher to accommodate those required cremations within core hours. Yes,
and it's a fair characterisation of your case that I think you said it yourself. Primarily, you are arguing that it is the relief provided to the Western Arc and Rose Hill, and so higher practical core capacity shows a greater need for relief.
Yes, I mean, I think yes, that's as an overall comment question. That is correct.
Yeah. B13 again, please, and section 7, the need statement.
Sorry.
So this is your the need statement.
I was going on to a different document. Section 7, did you say?
Section 7, please.
Yeah.
So it's a document that was produced in August 2019 that you now say that you read and had comments provided on it.
Yeah.
If we look at table 7.3, well, all the tables on that first page, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, which is looking to establish the number of cremations within 30-minute catchment drive time areas and unconstrained 30-minute catchment areas. You see those?
Yes, I do.
The cremation rate there used is 80%, isn't it?
It is. That's correct.
So on a document which you read and commented on, we find that the cremation rate is given as 80%.
It is. I think that is a conservative approach to take, but I'm not convinced it's the right approach. In preparing documents like this, it always is a balance between, you know, not overstating a case, but on the other hand, trying to be accurate with the forecast that you're making at the same time, and not unnecessarily being conservative. I think that just maintaining the 80% figure, because effectively that's where we were at that time, isn't the right thing to do, because ultimately what we should be trying to do is to model the genuine needs and make provision for the genuine needs. And if you believe that the cremation rate will continue to increase, as I do, then I think it's right and proper to take that into account.
Right, there's a number of things there in that reply. I just want to make, I'm not sure I've got a proper note. So you say that there was a conservative approach to take, though you're not convinced, I presume not convinced now that it is the right approach, and that there's a balance between not overstating your case. So you didn't want to overstate your case in your application, but that's not a consideration when you're writing your proof?
Well, I don't think I am overstating the case. I think if I'd have said 90%, then I would have been overstating the case. But based upon current trends, I think that 85% is attainable and will be the level in 2034.
But that wasn't your view just over 2 years ago when you were doing the planning application?
Well, I didn't ask that the report be changed to reflect that. I allowed the conservative view to remain in the report.
So you felt that it could be increased at appeal stage when increasing the cremation rate increases the number of cremations to increase the number of increase the demand on slots, showing that there's greater need to relieve?
I didn't change the percentage for this appeal, if that's what's underpinning your question. But in the projects that I have been involved in for Dignity over the last couple of years, including at Weeting, which is one of the appeals you've taken me to, I use the 85% figure there. Oh. Hello?
Sorry. Hello, I'm still here. I can hear you, Mr. Best. I can see the inspector moving. We can still see you, Mr. Best.
property inspector? No.
No.
Oh, right. My screen's just gone completely blank.
Oh, God.
IT support.
Switch it on, switch it off, switch it back on again.
I don't know what to Oh, Andy, hi, it's Peter. Could you get one of the IT guys up, please, to common room 8, because the screen's gone blank and we're in his. There's a witness in the middle of being cross-examined. Thanks, bye. I think there is a procedure. Yeah.
Mr. Village, would you like a short adjournment for 5 minutes just while he's sorted out, rather than? Would that be a suggestion?
I'm not sure you can hear you, ma'am. Perhaps if somebody in Mr. Village's team room might pop their head round, ma'am, if I may ask.
Oh, there are.
Ah.
Oh, there. There we go.
There really is no limits to Mr. Village's skills.
Is that the right thing? Yeah. Okay. I think you're on.
Welcome back, Mr. Best.
Sorry about that. You probably think I kicked the wire because I didn't like the question or something, but I don't know quite where you lost me. But I think I was saying that sometime before this inquiry, I did change my approach to increase the proportion of cremations, and it's not just for this appeal that I've done it.
Yes, you said at Weeting you used 85 as well. So is it just for appeals that you use 85?
No, I would do it for a report as well.
I want to look at the strength of the 85 assessment. If you turn to CDC1, which is Mr. Mitchell's need assessment.
Yes.
His figure 2.
Yes.
Which shows the percentage burials and cremations, and we see the significant increase in cremations from around the start of the war, Second World War, 39, through to the early to mid 80s, where the rise starts to become less stark. And this is a figure which I think you more or less agree with in your proof. Is that right?
I do. I find it difficult to read the numbers, but I think the trend is fairly clear. So I agree with the trend.
We'll put that down to eyesight.
Yes.
Rather than the figure itself. And Mr. Lathbury agreed yesterday that obviously you can't have over 100% of deaths resulting in cremations. I mean, that's plain as a pikestaff, isn't it?
It's worrying if you do.
It would be. I mean, even my statistics suggest that would be ridiculous. So I want to understand then, in the context of a less severe increase in cremations, where your 85 comes from, and I found it in 10.22 of your proof, which is on page 60.
Yes.
Where you say the cremation rate increased from 74.7% in 2003 to 80.2% in 2019, an average increase of 0.35% per annum. Based upon this rate, the cremation rate is likely to have increased further to around 85% by 2034. Now, even my admittedly A-level maths, that strikes me as a very bizarre way to calculate a potential increase. Because if you assume an average increase annually of 0.35%, then aren't you saying that therefore you will inevitably end up at over 100%? So by, I don't know, 20, let's work it out, 2080, thereabouts, you'd have over 100% of cremations because you'd be growing at 0.35% a year.
Well, fortunately, I don't have to worry about what happens at 2080 because I'll be one of the stats before then. I think that, yes, if you extrapolate forever, then clearly you're going to hit 100%. And based upon that, the approach you just articulated, go above it, which clearly isn't going to happen. But I'm concerned with the period to 2034. And within that period, I don't see any change in the proportion of funerals and cremations.
But it's obviously extrapolating it to 2080 shows you go above 100%. But what that shows is that just taking an average increase means that you are taking no account. You are assuming a constant growth and a regular growth.
I am, and I think that the graph in Mr. Mitchell's proof that you took me to, yes, it varies slightly year on year, but the trend since the 80s, as you pointed out, is fairly clear, and it's certainly been followed that in the period from 2003.
But what it doesn't, by assuming a constant and regular growth, you're not taking account of the issues raised by Mr. Mitchell and by Mr. Hodgson. So changes in level of demand due to religious preferences, green burials, as Mr. Hodgson explained yesterday. None of that is factored in.
The graph in Mr. Mitchell's proof is a graph.
Sorry, Mr. Best, Mr. IT support, Mr. Village.
Mr. Village, are you back in your usual role?
Yeah, I am indeed, and hopefully better at this than I am at IT. But I think Maleficent's got to be rather careful with his questions in relation to what Mr. Mitchell said, because Mr. Mitchell's position now, following cross-examination, is that on a balance of probability, the figure would be 85%. So it isn't the role of an advocate to change the evidence which one's own witness has provided. And just gently remind my learned friend, if I may, that his witness has now given his evidence, and you've heard that, and that remains his witness's position, that actually 85% is the correct percentage.
Thank you, Mr. Village. As I hoped I'd said earlier, with regard to the gold standard and the 1 hour slot, I'm not seeking to go behind Mr. Mitchell's evidence. I fully understand it's been given. That was not my intention here. It was to understand Mr. Best's approach so that the inspector could strike the balance. I think the answers have been given by Mr. Best to my questions. I take Mr. Village's point. Certainly wasn't my intention to go behind Mr. Mitchell's evidence. I apologise if that was where it appeared to be going. I won't be taking this point any further in any event. But I take your point, Mr. Village. It certainly wasn't where I was hoping to go.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. Perhaps if you could move on.
I will, absolutely. Direct cremation rates. So we've spoken a little bit about why this is important, because if the DCs go up, then the demand for core slots goes down. And so it's a matter of judgment forecasting into the future what that level of demand will be. Yes?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, in saying that, it assumes that all other factors are constant. And of course, the death rate, for example, is increasing, which, depending on your forecast of direct cremations, has quite a significant effect in counterbalancing the increase in direct cremations.
And at 7.13 of your proof on page 37,
yeah,
you tell us that you rely, Mr. Lathby explained in his evidence, the company's expectations on the level of future direct and hybrid cremations, and we have his evidence on it. You say, just at the start of that paragraph, that the experience of Dignity is that around 20% of direct cremations involve a limited number of people in attendance, but without a service, which you refer to as hybrid cremations. We have that sentence, and we have Mr. Lathbury's evidence yesterday. I don't think there's any supporting underlying evidence behind that 20% figure before the inspector, is there?
Just trying to think what Mr. Lathbury put in his evidence. I don't think he gave any sort of documentary evidence to substantiate that, but I think that he explained that from Dignity's perspective, the broadening of the market, which has taken place over the last few years, not only includes direct cremations, but includes packages whereby there may be no service, but there is attendance there.
Yes.
And that 20%, which I refer to as hybrid, is essentially those attended occasions.
But just so we're clear, the 20% figure you give there, there's no supporting documentary evidence available to the inspector. No. Rebalancing, please. Obviously, it takes a big part of your proof and a big part of your evidence yesterday. It's not something that we found in the original needs statement, is it?
No.
No, and that's the needs statement on which you commented. You didn't feel the need for rebalancing to be undertaken at that stage.
I didn't ask that it be put in there.
Okay, why not?
Presumably, I felt that it wasn't necessary at that time.
But is it a bit like we were discussing earlier, that it wasn't for an appeal, and rebalancing is back to you bringing it to appeal stage?
Again, for Wheating, we dealt with rebalancing. Excuse me.
Wheating appeal, of course.
Yeah. I think that the need statement that we put in with the application was comprehensive in the approach it took, but was commensurate with the stage, with the circumstances at the time, which was based upon that being the only proposal and Rosehill significantly overtrading. Clearly, we are now in a different situation. I was asked at relatively late on in the process to prepare a proof of evidence and appear here because a colleague had personal difficulties, and therefore I've excuse me, prepared my proof of evidence on the basis of what I believe to be the correct approach, and an approach which is consistent with the approach I took at Wheating.
But I understand that about your proof of evidence, but you said that you didn't ask for rebalancing to be put in to the needs statement. Now, surely at application stage, you put the most accurate assessment of need forward.
You do, yes.
And on your evidence, rebalancing is a key part of the most accurate assessment of need.
It is important. It wasn't undertaken in the need statement that supported the application, but I have now addressed it in my proof of evidence.
I mean, if it's a key part of assessing need, and you put your most accurate need case forward at application, rebalancing should have been part of it, shouldn't it? But you chose.
It's not a key part of need. Need is assessed in
impact.
Section 8. That is a slightly different matter. We did look at the trading effects of the proposed development, and of course that has now got more complicated because of Barnby Done, and Barnby Done will have an effect of significantly reducing the number of cremations that take place at Rose Hill, but not at the crematoria within the Western Arc, and therefore I consider that as a result of my scenario 2 assessment in chapter 10, that you need to take a step back and look at whether the results are realistic or not, and that's why I've undertaken the rebalancing exercise in that section of my evidence.
Even at application stage, there was the new crematoria in Retford, the Barnby Moor and Babworth crematoria, and even if it was just to rule out them having an impact on Rose Hill, surely you would have assessed, or you did assess in your, or you say you assessed in your needs statement the impact of Barnby Moor and Babworth, but surely you would have performed a rebalancing exercise on the effect of those two crematoria.
Well, this is something which took place 2 years ago. In hindsight, perhaps we should have undertaken the rebalancing exercise at that time. We didn't, and I have done now.
So you felt it wasn't essential to do a key part of assessing impact at application stage, but funnily enough, when you get to appeal here and at Weeting and at Wergs, it becomes a key part of the case.
I think it's an important part of the case, and that's why I've included it in my proof of evidence.
Right, let's look at what it actually is then, now that we established that it's only sometimes used. In Chief yesterday, and I took a good note of it, in Chief yesterday you said, it is assumed that everyone within a catchment is going to go to the nearest crematorium, so that's within your MDC area. Plainly that won't happen in every case, and I think that's agreed, and we heard from Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Mitchell on that. And then you said there will be flows either way, and that is flows across the boundaries of your MDC and NCA, yes?
Yes.
And then you said it's impossible to model, and therefore you assume that they are neutral. That was your evidence in Chief yesterday. Also in your proof at 10.49. Sorry.
I know you didn't ask me a question, but can I just clarify that point?
It is your evidence, so yes.
Yeah. So within appendix, I think it's JPB2. Is the table which you did go to yesterday, showing the results of the Westerly survey, why respondents chose a crematorium that was not their closest. And in evidence in Chief, I identified that some of those reasons effectively sort of had a planning resonance and others didn't. I think I said in evidence in Chief, but if I didn't make this clear, I apologise, that certain criteria are impossible to model. Reputation, it was the family crematorium, that type of thing. There is no way that anybody can factor that in, and so those are assumed to be neutral. But there are other criteria there, such as attractive and well-maintained buildings and ground, availability, etc., which can be considered, and it's those factors which I used in my scenario 3.
Yes, so you did go there yesterday in evidence. I think you said, according to my note, there are around 7 of those that you can model, and the rest are difficult. Nonetheless, you did say that it would be impossible to model and therefore assume they are neutral. And then if we look at your 10.49.
Sorry, just to be absolutely clear, it's the other ones, not the 7, the others that are impossible to model.
Okay, well then let's look at your 10.49. So at 10.49, you say it's not possible to accurately forecast crematorium choices using criteria other than convenience, full stop. Now that doesn't say other than convenience and the other elements contained in IPB2, does it? It just says other than convenience. Not possible to accurately forecast other than convenience.
Ultimately, the scenario 3 is professional judgment based upon the qualitative circumstances that apply to the west and the east of the appeal site. So it is based upon the modelling using the choice, the convenience choice, and then takes into account those other criteria.
Right. We'll get to the detail of your judgment in a moment. I just want to understand where it sits in your evidence in terms of the ability to accurately forecast it. So impossible and impossible to accurately forecast we've got from you. You'll recall Mr. Lathbury was taken yesterday by Mr. Barrett to the CMA report. If you could turn that up, please, E2, just to remind ourselves. I won't go through, read them out. Mr. Barrett did that yesterday, so they should be fresh in everybody's mind. But if we start at 6.98, page 2.
Bear with me.
Yeah, no problem. It's absolutely enormous.
Did you say B2 or D2?
It sounds like a Star Wars character. E2.
E2.
Sorry, which page did you say?
It's electronic page 277 of 497, marked page 274 in the bottom centre.
Thank you.
Are you there? Are you there, ma'am? So we're told at 6.98 that out of area customers are customers who would have a closer alternative. And then at 6.100, the CMA states that both points suggest that the extent to which private crem operators attract out of area customers will overstate the extent to which private crematoria compete for marginal customers. And that not all out of area customers are customers who choose a crematorium on the basis of price or quality. Now let's remember price or quality, and as such may be considered to be marginal. So the CMA's view is that price or quality are marginal considerations in choosing out of catchment crematoria. The next reference was 6.146. The proportion of customers that use their crematoria but have a closer alternative, we have found that a material proportion of customers at both private and local are from out of area, which indicates that not all out of area customers are private are customers who chose a private crematorium because of any superior offering or better value for money. So again, price and quality. And then importantly, at the bottom, starting last sentence on 296, it is also relevant that flows occur in both directions between local authority and private crematoria and between crematoria of the same type. The proportion of private crematoria customers who choose private crematoria on the basis of price or quality, again, price or quality, may be considered to be marginal, is relatively limited and lower than the proportions indicated by Dignity, Westerly and Memoria. And then the conclusions at 6.147. There's a higher degree of variation in the proportion of customers that attract from out of catchment. Evidence shows that there are a range of geographic and local factors unrelated to competition. We have found that the proportions of out of area customers at private crematoria increases as slot lengths are longer and fees are lower, but the relationships aren't strong. So what the CMA is telling us is that, if I may summarise, there's flows in both directions, that price and quality are marginal considerations, and that it varies across a high degree of variation across different operators, and importantly that the three main private operators, Dignity, Westerly and Memoria, have a tendency to overstate their ability to attract from out of area. You see all of those references?
Yes.
When we look at how you've attempted to, or the considerations you've used in your proof for remodelling, so we're into section 10, scenario 3. And paragraph 10.45. I consider that the proposed developments will be of an excellent quality in physical and operational terms, and therefore a proportion of people will choose to use it, even though in the Western Arc it may not be the most convenient location. So you are essentially using quality as the basis for your rebalancing assessment.
Yes, that is one of the factors, certainly, and I see what the CMA say on that. I think that you do need to take into account the specific circumstances of the local area. The CMA report concerned a national situation, and this may or may not be typical of that. But we see in the local area that, and figure 10.2a shows this clearly, that almost all of the NCA is less than a 30-minute drive time. And we agreed earlier that the 30-minute drive time was the extent to which people, the public, consider that is a suitable or a maximum drive time from a qualitative perspective. So I think that it is feasible and likely in this situation that the qualitative offer of Dignity within a 30-minute drive time will be attractive to people in the Western Arc where it's within the 30-minute drive time. And it's not just the quality, which incidentally in the Westerly survey, which we went to at JPB2, that was the highest rated reason for choice. But it's also it's also waiting times. And each of those existing crematoria have long waiting times. And therefore, people, if no rebalancing takes place, we would be in a situation where the public would be offered longer waiting times for a less attractive crematorium because it is slightly more convenient than a new good quality scheme with shorter waiting times.
We know that Westerly took, sorry.
And I just, in this circumstance, I don't think that's realistic, and therefore I think rebalancing will take place.
We know that Westerly took part in the CMA assessment and took a very active part in it. And I think it's safe to assume that their data from that survey was made available to the CMA. The survey was 2016, CMA report was last year.
Sorry, is that a question?
It is, yeah. Would you agree
Yeah,
with that assumption?
They did take part in it. I don't know the extent to how actively they were involved in it.
And so the detailed consideration of the CMA conclusions will be based upon, in part, an assessment of what Westerly have told them.
I assume that in taking into account their findings at a national level, the CMA took into account the Westerly evidence.
Yeah. Now, your assessment that you gave there as to the specifics of this area is something that I don't think is in your brief. Is it in your brief? We just find the sentence which I took you to in scenario 3. You consider that the proposed development will be of an excellent quality in physical and operational terms. That's your description in your brief, not what you just gave to the inspector now.
Well, that is the description in my proof. You've asked me the question and I've given you an answer in relation to it.
Now, necessarily, I think you've said that rebalancing involves an element of judgment in terms of the percentage that you apply to it.
Yes.
And in 10.48 of your brief, you tell us that you take 30% of cremations of outside of area. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And your 30% comes from the what we see in 10.45. As I've explained above, 20 to 30% of crematoria are selected based upon considerations other than that which is the most convenient.
Yeah, I think actually I'm doing myself a slight injustice there, because I think earlier I've referred to the fact that the Dignity evidence was in excess of 30% and the Westerly was 20 to 30%.
So when we look at your evidence at 10.45, you've taken the highest of that range, 20 to 30%. You've taken the highest
of that range, but in relation to the Dignity submissions, I've taken the lower figure.
And you've taken the lower figure from Dignity. Did the CMA report play any part in your assessment?
Well, I'm aware of the overall recommendations of the CMA report, and I accept that that was their findings, but ultimately I consider that in the circumstances of Brodsworth there will be rebalancing, because I don't think it's realistic to assume that the proximity of a new good quality crematorium won't attract people other than by convenience.
Proximity of a new quality crematorium.
Correct.
Mr. Robson, just pause there for a moment, please. I've just noticed Mr. Village's hand's gone up, or is that a legacy hand, Mr. Village?
Apologies. I don't think it was even. I think I removed my legacy hand some time ago, so I think I must have accidentally slipped on the mouse.
Okay, no worries. Just wanted to double check. Carry on, Mr. Robson.
Thank you. Other than by proximity. Now we see the effect of your rebalancing in table 10.13. And that's when we look at the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3.
Yes.
So the effect of the rebalancing is that peak month capacity at Rose Hill and Barnby Dun goes up, and peak month as a percentage of factored capacity goes down at Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham.
Yes.
So the effect of your judgment is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, you're providing greater relief to the Western Arc, but you're doing less to affect. So I want to phrase this properly. Less to affect potential levels of income at Rose Hill,
Well, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of levels of income.
Well, I know there's no argument now that Rose Hill is not viable. If you drop significantly below 80%, then I think we can agree it will affect the levels of income that come into Rose Hill. Between 52% and 60%, 60% will bring in more income to Rose Hill than 52%.
Yes, it would, but sorry if I was unclear. In doing the modelling exercise, I wasn't thinking how much income will this take from any particular location. I was thinking about the likely patterns in terms of crematoria and cremations.
Yes, so it's, to be clear, it's the your approach of how possible or impossible it is to assess accurately. The highest point taken from the 30%, and then the consequences of that we see at your 10.13.
Yes.
Now, I think Mr. Lathbury agreed yesterday that Barnby Moor is a high quality, modern and new facility. Would you agree with him?
Yes.
As is Babworth?
Yes.
And as will be Barnby Dun?
Yes.
Now, rebalancing is, I think you'll agree, is a in your case is a market phenomena. It's not a phenomena limited only to Dignity's development at Brodsworth.
Yes. Yes.
Yet, when you go through your calculations, there's no rebalancing done for Barnby Moor. There's no rebalancing done for Babworth, although I take your view that Babworth will have limited effect on Rose Hill anyway. And there's no rebalancing done for the effect of Barnby Dun, is there?
Barnby Moor, I approach it effectively in the scenario 2 way of looking at convenience, modelling it based on convenience. Barnby Moor is considerably further afield from Rose Hill, and all the evidence that was submitted at that time indicates that the relieving effect of Barnby Moor on Rose Hill will be limited. I agree with that, and I factored that in. I think that it's fair to say that in the short term, there may be a greater proportion of diversion from within Doncaster Borough, which is the Rose Hill catchment area. But I think that will fall away when Barnby Dun becomes operational. The reason for that is in the short term, we know and agree that Rose Hill is overtrading, and therefore I agree with Mr. Mitchell that it's likely to be higher in the short term than my 64 cremations, which I've modelled for 2034. But I think that will fall back when Barnby Dun opens and the operational levels of Rose Hill are lower, because I don't think people will be so prepared to drive further to Barnby Moor when they can get a slot more easily at Rose Hill.
Did you do a rebalancing exercise for Barnby Dun?
No, I didn't.
Did you do a rebalancing exercise for Barnby Moor?
Well, I've just given you the reason for Barnby Moor. I don't think that's necessary. The modelling that I've undertaken is for 2034, and I think that for reasons of proximity, after Barnby Dun is open, I think that will be in balance anyway.
Isn't your answer there just an explanation of the weaknesses of rebalancing, that over time, as the market changes, as crematorium become fully operational, as people's as new crematoria open, as there are shifts within the market, it finds its level, which is further emphasis, is it not, of why rebalancing is inaccurate and impossible to forecast?
Well, I think the way you put that question almost answers itself, because the provision and use of existing crematoria and new crematoria will find its level. That's absolutely right. And the most fundamental characteristic of the circumstance once Barnby Dun is open is that provision on the eastern side of Doncaster will be considerably improved, both in quantitative and qualitative terms. But there won't be any qualitative improvements on the western side, and there won't be any qualitative improvements. There is a slight reduction, but not significant. And therefore, the rebalancing exercise effectively is to take a fairly simple and broad brush approach of asking whether that is likely. Is that the water level we're likely to be at? And I don't think it is without the rebalancing. I think that there will be a greater take from the western side and a lesser take from the eastern side, and that I've undertaken in scenario 3 in my evidence.
And that's the judgment that we've been through.
Yes.
I want quickly. Sorry, Mum. I know now it's 5 to 11. I have one more topic to cover, which I would hope to be able to do within 10 to 15 minutes. Whether we take a break now or whether we go for 10 to 15 minutes and then break before Mr. Barrett. Sorry.
I'm guided by you on that, whether you'd rather continue.
Sorry, Mum.
I don't have a strong preference. Mr. Best, are you able to continue, or would you rather have a
continue and take a break at the natural point?
Yeah,
excellent.
That's fine. Continue then.
Yep.
Mr. Robson.
My view as well. I just wanted to check, Mr. Best, and you got 5 minutes in the middle when your screen. So enough respite. The diversion to Barnby Moor. So your case is 64. That's 64 is based upon the drive time MDC, the NCA of Barnby Moor, and the number of deaths and therefore the number of cremations in the overlap area, i.e. the bit of the extremities of Rose Hills pre-Barnby Moor NCA that Barnby Moor's NCA will gobble up once it's at maturity.
Yes.
For a kind of semi-1980s Pac-Man reference. Mr. Mitchell's figure 20. Which is at page 47 of his proof.
Yes.
His 2081 in column 1 for Rose Hill.
Yes.
And the 572 at Barnby Moor. You see those?
Yes, I do.
Now the 572 for Barnby Moor is broadly. So let's talk about what these. So these are Mr. Mitchell's version of modelling the MDC and the number of cremations that would be in Barnby Moor's MDC, and the number of cremations that would be in Rose Hill's MDC before Barnby, Dun and Brodsworth are developed.
Yes.
And his figure is 2081 for Rose Hill and 572 for Barnby Moor.
Correct.
It's reminding me why I didn't take my further maths A level. One way of checking the validity or verifying modelling is to check it against actuals. Would you agree with that?
Possibly. The reason I say that is because in theory, you'd have a town with a rural hinterland which had one crematorium, and the number of cremations it undertakes it would match the natural catchment area.
Yes,
roughly. But life isn't like that, and patterns of population, communication to roads, and needs are not uniform, and therefore we know that at Rose Hill it does roughly another 500 cremations beyond that figure for the NDC.
Yes.
I'm reluctant to agree with your question, because clearly in the real world we know that Rose Hill is trading beyond its natural catchment area.
Yes, that's right. So what we know from the 2019 actuals versus the 2019 NCA projection calculations is that the calculations tell us it should be doing 2,081 if 100% of the cremations within its catchment went to Rose Hill. But the actuals for 2019 tell us that it did 2,500.
Yes.
Thereabouts. So that difference is where Rose Hill is trading outside its NCA limits.
It tells us that Rose Hill is trading beyond its NCA limits.
Yes.
But it doesn't tell us anything more than that.
Now, if we look at the actuals, if we go to your brief, the actuals which you include in your section 9, and it's table 9.1, I think, from memory.
Yeah.
So 2017 Rose Hill actuals 2,550. No Barnby Moor, not built yet.
Yeah.
Not well, being built, I assume, but not operational. 2018 actuals 2,545. Barnby Moor still not operational.
Yes.
2019, a drop to 2,379.
Yes.
Barnby Moor is then online from I think it was April or slightly earlier, 2019.
Yes.
Yes. So in 2019, the NCA of Rose Hill, which is based on maturity, isn't it? It's based on new crematoria being at a fully mature trading level.
Yes.
At 2019, we've got a model telling us that it should be doing 2081, and the actuals telling us it does 2379, which is a reduction of 166 from 2018.
Yes.
What other change between 2018 and 2019 would explain the reduction of 166, or even not exactly 166? I accept the majority of 166. What change other than the opening and operation of Barnby Moor would lead to that drop?
If you look further down that table to the Western Arc average, you can see that in 2018 there were 2,080 cremations in those 3 crematoria, and that fell to 2,038 in 2019. Now, there's no obvious reason for that in terms of new provision, really. And you can see that over time it fluctuates. So, sorry, 2017 it was lower, then it rose, and then it fell again. So there are changes year on year just because of changes in death rates. Now, the change in death rate nationally doesn't vary very much other than for long-term trends, but the smaller the area you are, the more prone it is to that. So I think that an unknown proportion of that 166 is likely to be simply changes in death rates in that area of the Rose Hill catchment area. Now, I agree that a proportion will also be people who have gone to Barnby Moor, and I've previously said that in the short term, I think that might be a higher proportion, reflecting the fact that Rose Hill is very busy and it's difficult to get a slot at the moment, whereas the opposite is true of Barnby Moor. But I think as Barnby Dun comes on stream and relieves a more significant amount of pressure on Rose Hill, that those people who are in the Rose Hill natural catchment area, but perhaps at the moment would choose to go a bit further to Barnby Moor, would stay with or go back to Rose Hill.
Now, of course, you've got so 2 things from that. Of course, there's natural variation, and we can see that across all of the locations in your table 9.1. But just looking at Rose Hill, admittedly only between 2 years, but 17 and 18, the variation is 5. The variation across other locations doesn't appear to be as pronounced as that variation between 18 and 19 at Rose Hill, which would suggest, would it not, that there is a large part of that variation would be down to diversion to Barnby Moor?
I've agreed that a part of it will be. I don't know whether it's a large part, but a part of it will be. But I think that this is a temporary phenomenon, and I think that once Barnby Dun is built and has a mature pattern of trading, that will revert back to the patterns that I've forecast for 2034.
And Barnby Dun is to the north of Doncaster.
Yes.
And Barnby Moor to the south of Doncaster.
Yeah.
Now, there is some overlap at the extremities there, but they are fundamentally pulling from or drawing from different catchments around the main conurbation, aren't they?
They are, but that's not my point. My point is that because of how busy Rose Hill is at present, it's difficult to get a slot. And this is where it comes back to the waiting times. If you live south of Doncaster at the moment, but within Doncaster Borough, i.e. the Rose Hill catchment area, you have a choice of a shorter journey to Rose Hill, but a longer wait, or a longer journey to Barnby Moor,
A shorter wait.
And a shorter wait. And that's your choice. And that's why I think in the short term, there will be a higher proportion of people who decide to go for the Barnby Moor option. But in the longer term, when you've got a shorter wait and a shorter journey at Rose Hill, I think it will even out again.
But then one of the major considerations for your rebalancing and increasing your figures at Brodsworth, at your appeal site, is it's a new, higher quality facility. And whether or not Barnby Dun relieves some of the overtrading at Rose Hill will still remain an older facility versus Barnby Moor. So on your case, the way you assess it for your scheme, that would be a pull to Barnby Moor, wouldn't it? The fact that it is a newer, more modern facility.
It will, but the journey times are longer, and it goes back to the plan at 10.2a, which shows that almost all of the NCA is within the 30 minutes, and there are quite substantial areas in the Western Arc which are beyond the NCA, but still within a 30-minute Cortege drive time. So that's the difference.
Now the complex judgment that you explained in terms of Barnby Moor in the short term would pull more than the 64 from Rose Hill. Over time, that would, you say, level back to 64 because Barnby Dun would relieve Rose Hill. That would be, is it not a rebalancing exercise to make that assessment?
It is essentially, but the approach in my evidence effectively misses out that, as far as Barnby Moor is concerned, misses out that interim period and looks at 2034. So that's why it's not necessary to look at that rebalancing.
Well, that's it. But that's it, isn't it? That's exactly it. Is that you ignore the rebalancing effect for every other of the new crematoria that will be delivered within Doncaster, apart from your own.
Well, I've explained several times the circumstances for Barnby Moor, and I've also explained that in relation to the appeal proposal, I've taken, excuse me, I've taken a fairly broad brush approach based upon the busyness of the Western crematoria and the relative capacity of the Eastern crematoria, and adjusted it on that basis. That's what I've done, and it's for all to see.
And if you had have done the rebalancing exercise on your own approach of quality being a key driver for attracting outside of area, then the only direction in which that 64 figure goes is up.
Based upon quality alone, Barnby Moor would be more attractive, yes.
So the 460 that Mr. Mitchell put in his late evidence, that is to some extent unaccounted for between the actuals and the model. When the inspector looks for accounting for where that 460 goes, that could be part of the rebalancing to a mature Barnby Moor.
Well, I think if we go back to the table from Mr. Mitchell's evidence that you took me to earlier, figure 20, Mr. Mitchell sets out his three scenarios there, and the MDC for Barnby Moor remains the same in all three scenarios. So effectively, the maximum number of cremations, and I appreciate this is for 2019 and not a design year, but the maximum number of cremations he's identified from that area is 572. Now, that will increase over the 15 years to 2034, but it's not going to increase massively. So on the basis of his figures, it's probably like to be in the low 600s, something like that. Well, that being the case, I just don't believe that a proportion that 460 cremations would divert from Rose Hill to Barnby Moor in the context of that number of overall cremations, and given the travel distances and the fact that in 2034 Rose Hill would be trading at a far lower level, and therefore availability of slots would be much greater.
So you don't believe that it would divert despite the agreed quality, in your judgment, of Barnby Moor being greater than Rose Hill, and that not changing through to 2034. So for Barnby Moor, you don't see quality as a pull factor, but for Brodsworth, you do.
Well, the circumstances are different.
No, the circumstances are the same. It's just how you choose to give, what weight you choose to give to
they're
quality.
not. In the case of Rose Hill and Barnby Moor, the travel distances are further, and the number of cremations that will be taking place, its busyness at Rose Hill will be far lower. That contrasts to the situation post Brodsworth with the Western Arc, whereby the distances are much shorter, and all three existing crematoria will be far busier than Rose Hill. And so the propensity for people to divert to Brodsworth will be greater than the comparative equivalent of Barnby Moor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Best. Marlon, those were my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Robson and Mr. Best. Mr. Village, you've raised your hand. Did you have an objection?
Well, it's OTOs now, because my then friend interrupted the witness in his answer, but the witness then managed to hold on and gave the full answer that I was taking a note of. And given he's finished his cross-examination, I don't have anything further to say.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Village. Okay, well, it's 11:15. I think that would be a good time to take a short adjournment till 11:30. Is that okay for everyone?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, I shall adjourn the inquiry till then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. It's 11:30. We shall now resume the inquiry. Okay, Mr. Barrett, would you like to commence your cross-examination of Mr. Best? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, Mr. Best.
Good morning.
Mr. Best, I'll try and avoid going over the ground of Malone and friend Mr. Robson, but I'm afraid there will be some crossover. I hope in advance to minimise that. But can I begin by asking you, no crossover here, to turn up core document E2, which is the CMA report?
Yes,
Ma'am, do you have that?
I do.
If everybody's got it, go to paragraph 11. It's the executive summary. Makes the point that over 78% of the deceased are cremated. When it comes to choosing a crematorium, most customers do so on the basis of location, how close the crematorium is to where the deceased live, or familiarity, whether they have been there before. Again, price is rarely a relevant factor in their choice, and although quality matters to customers in general, very few customers compare alternative crematoria. See that?
I do see that.
Do you accept that conclusion?
I accept their findings. That's their view. I think, as I said to Mr. Robson, that relates to a national picture, and I do think that at a planning inquiry you need to take into account local circumstances.
Can we take it to be the opinion of an informed and expert body? Informed and expert body. Yeah. Paragraph 6.
I guess they became expert over the time of their investigation, yes.
Paragraph 16 and 17 of the executive summary, I think. On the crematoria side, there is obviously a discussion in the CMA document about the funeral directors component of the bereavement industry. On the crematoria side, in addition to competitive constraints being weak due to customers' tendency to choose a crematorium on the basis of location or familiarity, there are two significant barriers to entry by crematoria, which have contributed to the high level of concentration of the sector: the planning regime and the high sunk and fixed costs associated with the opening and operation of a crematorium. Historically, crematoria were opened by local authorities seeking to serve their local population. 61% are still operated by them. Since the 1980s, private companies have opened many new crematoria, but faced with high barriers to entry, they have tended to focus on areas where there was no or limited supply within a reasonable distance, and to simply keep up with growing demand. As a result, today, crematoria are generally few and far between. A point I think that's made in Mr. Lathbury's evidence is derived from this paragraph. Many people have ready access to only one local crematorium, and few have access to more than 3, to the extent that some crematoria may attract some customers on the basis of the quality of their offering, which normally means the underlying standard and maintenance of the buildings and grounds and the duration of the funeral service. There are not enough customers choosing a crematoria on this basis for it to drive an effective competitive process. Therefore, whilst there are some differences in local competitive conditions between local areas in terms of the number and identities of providers, and hence in the choice available in principle to customers, we have found that competition between crematorium operators is generally very muted. Again, an observation that you wouldn't disagree with in terms of it coming from the CMA.
As a generality, I don't disagree with it. I would comment that where you have a situation where crematoria are few and far between, and where many people have ready access to only one local crematorium, it is hardly surprising that most people do choose the crematorium based on convenience. And clearly, in a market which operates well and provides choice and competition, people are more likely to choose a crematorium on the basis of quality or other considerations where there is a choice of 3 or more local to them.
Okay. Come back to the issue broadly when we come to rebalancing, but can I ask you to flick forward in the report to the point where we get to those observations in the executive summary? Would you go to page electronic page 154, it's page 151 if you've got a hard copy of this document, and paragraph 4.79, conclusions on barriers to entry. And one of the considerations that the CMA grappled with was whether the planning regime was too onerous in delivering new crematoria, wasn't it? That was something that they had to apply their minds to.
They certainly referred to it, yes.
And if you look at the last 2 sentences of 479, please read that it in its entirety if you think that assists, but I think these are the 2 relevant sentences. We consider that the needs test, this is in the planning regime, is broadly aligned with the economic incentives to open a new crematorium, which has to conduct a sufficient number of cremations to cover its high fixed costs. This means that removing any barriers to entry arising through the planning regime, in particular the needs test, is unlikely to significantly affect the likelihood of entry. In other words, they're not going to interfere, essentially, or not recommend an interference with the planning regime.
Yes, that's what they say.
Okay. Now, I want to consider, let's get rid of that. I want to consider the background to this application with you, if I may. And I want to begin by asking the point that of the 3 crematoria applications that were submitted to Doncaster, the first in time was that of your clients, wasn't it? Was it not?
That's correct.
And I'm right in saying again that Barnby Dunn and the Horizon application was submitted sometime later, and self-evidently your need assessment did not take into account those applications.
Correct.
Having considered that there was no other applications coming forward, or that was the assumption that must have been at the time, no case was made in the submitted need assessment, and if you want to look at it, it's CDA10, CDA10. No case was made for there being a case for 2 crematoria being needed.
No, there wasn't. I think it would be surprising if a need report's submitted in the circumstances of this case sought to justify 2. It sought to justify the proposed development.
Yes, but as part of the assessment, it could, and one sees this frequently the case in other similar types application, that the case of need is so overwhelming that even with the development proposal, the subject matter of the immediate application, there would still remain a residual unmet need.
That can be a case that's put forward. I wouldn't say it was a particularly common way of dealing with it, but it can be.
And because the need assessment submitted by your clients was a product of its time, I'd also be right in saying that whilst there is reference to, quite extensive reference to Barnsley, no substantive case was made for the relief of the Western Arc being a prime justification for that application.
No, at the time that the need assessment was prepared and the application was submitted, it focused on the relief that would be provided to Rose Hill. Yeah.
Yeah. Which leads to a point that I think I ought to make at this juncture. It was developed to some extent by Mr. Robson, but it's this. The importance of rebalancing was recognised by you subsequent to the needs assessment. There was no rebalancing, for example, of the two then approved schemes at Barnby Moor and the other one. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, in preparing my evidence, which started 3 weeks before the exchange date, from my perspective, obviously work had been done by others, but I decided, based upon the approach I'd taken elsewhere, that I thought rebalancing was important, and that's why I've included it.
But rebalancing was important, of course, to have been done in a sequential stage, because at the time of the preparation of your evidence, Barnby Dun was approved, and you certainly proceeded on the basis that it would happen.
I have.
One of the consequences of Barnby Dun happening is that there would be relief, considerable relief, to Rose Hill.
That's correct.
So one of the things that you would do if you were following your own methodology is rebalance at that point. Rose Hill, because of the relief provided by Barnby Dun, becomes a more attractive option on your analysis in qualitative terms, because it can now offer longer slot lengths. Its capacity is greater because some has been diverted to Barnby Dun, and it then can contribute to relieving the Western Arc.
I don't see that after Barnby Dun, Rose Hill is likely to relieve the Western Arc. Rose Hill is located on the eastern side of Doncaster. Whilst I think it will become a more attractive proposition based upon wait times, potentially slot lengths after Barnby Dun opens, the distance from the Western Arc to it, and the quality of it, I don't think would play a significant role in rebalancing.
Well, you can't say that, Mr. Best, unless you've done the exercise. And quite frankly, you simply did not do the exercise, did you?
Well, I'm the only one who has rebalanced.
Well, that's not what Mr. said in cross-examination, but would you like to answer my question? My question was, you needed to do that exercise to inform your own judgment as to what the position would be when your client's site became operational.
I've just told you that I don't believe that Rose Hill would draw from Western Arc. I've included a rebalancing exercise of the appeal proposal in the light of Barnby Dun and Rose Hill. I think that's informative, but I don't think there would be any rebalancing in relation to Rose Hill and Western Arc as a result of Barnby Dun.
On your own evidence, Mr. Best, that is an exercise that should have been done before, shouldn't it? Even if you're now telling me your conclusion, but you needed to do the exercise before you reached the conclusion, an exercise that you haven't done.
I haven't done the exercise in terms of the proof, but I've just given you an explanation as to why.
Would you go? Would you take up your own figure 10.2a, page 58 of your evidence, and at the same time have Mr. Hodgson's evidence, page 11, close by?
Yes.
Mr. Hodgson's map 5.1 is on page 12 is the one that I want specifically to draw your attention to. And I need to compare it with your figure 10.2a.
Yes.
What we should have is a 30-minute Cortege drive time, which is, to all intents and purposes, should be identical on these two plans, shouldn't it?
30-minute drive time from the appeal proposal should be similar or identical.
Well, they're not, are they? Because if you look at, for example, Mr. Hodgson's, which is the yellow line.
Yes.
Rose Hill is virtually on the boundary of the 30-minute Cortege drive time.
It is.
Whereas your 30-minute Cortege drive time, Rose Hill is well within it.
That's correct.
And if I look at Barnsley, for example, to the west of your client's proposal, again, Mr. Hodgson's 30-minute drive time shows a significantly different level of interaction. Again, your 30-minute drive time touches Barnsley. Barnsley is well outside of Mr. Hodgson's.
That's the difference, yes.
Now, there shouldn't be that difference, should there?
If they are both correct, then no, there wouldn't be. Obviously, drive times do vary day to day, and to a certain extent, the modelling takes that into account based upon what the model considers are typical circumstances at the time that's been set. But nonetheless, you wouldn't expect a significant difference.
And you certainly wouldn't expect the differences that we see here.
You would expect them to be broadly similar.
Yeah. Can I ask you one question? On your plan, figure 10.2a, the shaded, the grey area, the dark area embedded within, for the most part, the 30-minute drive time, has an area to the northeast which is outside the 30-minute drive time. How is your NDC derived in this case? Your NCA.
It is derived based upon the locations within which the proposed development would be the most convenient.
Relative to what?
Relative to the same criteria to other crematoria.
Is that qualitative or quantitative?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Is that qualitative?
No.
Okay. The normal exercise, I won't say the normal exercise, the exercise would be to consider the population then within the NCA and then the death rate within that population, would it not? Yours is a different exercise, as you explained to Mr. Robson a moment ago. Right?
Well, in section 10, I take the deaths within the NCA, but I don't take the population.
What you explained to Mr. Robson is that you based your need case in the appeal proposal on the relief that was afforded to the Western Arc.
I based my need case in chapter 9 on the extent of overtrading of the existing crematoria based upon existing cremation rates and forecast trends to 2034.
Again, I want to just take a big picture here. If I look at your evidence, and I'm not looking at Mr. Hodgson's evidence, I'll come to that in a moment. If I look at your figures alone, I'd be right in saying that the 80% qualitative achievement, so that you can have your 1 hour, 45-minute plus slot times, is not achieved for any of the Western Arc crematoria, is it?
Are you asking whether, based upon the number of cremations that are undertaken, it's after relief from the proposed development, it's possible to achieve hour-long slots?
No, I'm not.
Okay,
Let me
understand your question.
One of the measures of quality, of capability of quality, is the 80% figure that's been discussed throughout the inquiry.
80% of practical or factor capacity?
Yeah.
Yes.
Not in one instance at the Western Arc, at any of the periods of time that we look at, does the introduction of the Brodsworth scheme relieve any of the crematoria in the Western Arc to that level or below it, the 80% level?
No, it doesn't, and that's a factor of the extent of need within the Western Arc. I don't believe that one single crematorium can achieve that. I think ultimately this is a factor of the 3 crematoria in the Western Arc being constructed in the 50s and 60s, and there being no subsequent crematoria built on the eastern side of that since.
Now, if I look at just the locational characteristics of the appeal site, which, when at the time of its inception was being driven on the basis of the contribution that it could make to improve Rose Hill's capacity, that is no longer needed for Rose Hill, correct?
It's sorry, that is correct. The benefit to Rose Hill is additional choice and competition for the public, but it's not required to reduce trading levels below the 80%.
And then I would be fair in characterizing your client's case today as now having a shift in focus directed towards the Western Arc crematoria, which form now part of the need assessment in your evidence.
Since the submission of the application, the council has granted planning permission for the Barnaby Dunn scheme, and therefore my evidence takes that into account. I've just agreed with you that relieves a lot of pressure on Rose Hill, but it doesn't relieve pressure on the Western Arc. And in my view, the proposed development would help achieve that and improve operating conditions within the Western Arc.
I just want, just before we leave these maps, to deal with one matter. The methodology in Appendix 1 to Mr. Hodgson's evidence, showing the drive times, each component of the drive times in his Appendix 1. It's Appendix 1 of Appendix 1, essentially, if that's not too obtuse. It's not something that I can replicate in your case, is it?
No, it's not. I don't think that's unusual, but I don't include that, no.
Okay. And I want to touch upon some other elements under my heading of, I don't expect you to accept this, a paucity of analysis in the case presented at this appeal. However population is derived, I cannot find in your evidence a breakdown of where the population is that you are identifying and how it will be diverted. If I'm wrong,
I'm not diverting population, I'm diverting deaths.
Yeah. which is what I understand your answer to Mr. Robson to be. You haven't started from looking analogous to perhaps a retail assessment, where you look at the population and its spend. In this case, it might not be its spend, but its lifespan, its expectations, and then work out where that's going to be distributed. You've started, as I understand it, from the other end. You've started from the factual position of the 3 crematoria in the Western Arc, from the proposition that, of course, they're self-evidently overtrading, and this development can afford some relief to them.
Well, I first assess the need for the facility, as you say, based upon the extent to which they are overtrading. And in the days when it was necessary to do a similar exercise for a retail development, I would have done a similar exercise then. It would have used different data, but I would have used a similar exercise then to assess the extent to which the existing stores or centres are overtrading. That, I think, is a logical starting point, and it's based upon information, in this case, that's readily available. I then go on to look at diversion patterns subsequent to that. Now, in the retail world, there isn't the way you derive information on, or the way you forecast the turnover of stores or centres is based upon expenditure information from one source and population from another. It is applying the population to the expenditure per head. Now, I don't need to do that here because I have the death information. I can go straight to the death information. Now, clearly there is a relationship between the size of the population and the number of deaths within an area, but I don't need to dwell on the population. I can just go straight to the deaths. And clearly, within any given area, a mortality rate may vary from one area to another. And therefore, because a catchment area has a population of a certain size, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a fixed number of deaths in that area.
Let me make the obvious point, Mr. Best. On that analysis, you can have no understanding of the source and location of those using the Western Arc Crematorium. The cohort that are using that could be significantly further to the west. Unless you do the exercise of identifying the population and where it is from, your judgment, which is based upon just the number of deaths that are being dealt with, I beg your pardon, the number of cremations dealt with in the Western Arc, doesn't tell you anything about the propensity of diversion rates, does it?
Moving on from the need section, in section 10 of my evidence, through the definition of natural catchment areas, I know where, in effect, the population is and where the deaths are. Now, the plans that are used in the evidence, and we've all got similar plans, show broad areas, but from that you can identify on a more detailed plan where the population is, or where the urban areas are more definitively. But I know the number of deaths that are within the Pontefract natural catchment area. I know the number of deaths that are within the proposed catchment area, the proposed development, and I know where the overlap is. So from that, I do get a geographical perspective.
No, Mr. Best, I didn't interrupt you. I'll let you give you a very full answer. But consider the point that we agreed very early on, and Mr. Lathbury accepted without equivocation. The prime driver of the choice of crematorium is location. your analysis is bereft, absolutely bereft of looking at the source of each of those Western Arcs population that is going to use that crematorium. And because it's based on primarily location, you have absolutely no idea, over and above an anecdotal assessment, what cremations are being taken and the population that it is being served by those crematorium, do you?
It's not the population that's cremated, it's the people who have died that are cremated. I have the death figures for each of those areas. I have the death figures for the overlap. Therefore, I know the number of deaths that are in the overlapping areas. That is the geographical perspective.
No, no. Okay, then.
Sorry, let me finish. In the scenario 2 of my chapter 10, I model that on the same basis as Mr. Hodgson, in that I apportion the number of cremations based upon those death figures and the related cremation figures that are derived from it.
Where in your evidence, and please take me to it, Mr. Best, will you be able to point me and the inspector to an assessment of the deaths, the location of those persons who are cremated at the Western Arc crematorium? Knowing as we do that the principal basis of choice is location, not quality or any other consideration. Where do I find that?
Okay, so figure 10.2a.
Yes.
That defines the natural catchment areas. That's essentially the same as the MDCs. So within the area, let's take Pontefract as an example. Within the area that's coloured red, that is the catchment area of Pontefract. Within that geographical area, Pontefract is the most convenient crematorium for deaths in that area. In table 10.1, I take the death figure for Pontefract based upon that geographical area, and I set it out as 2,339. I do that for each of them, each crematorium, and that gives me the existing position. And I then go along subsequently to assess where the overlaps are, the number of cremations within those overlapping areas, and apportion it in the same way in scenario 2 as Mr. Hodgson.
Let's just have a look at some of those. Let's stay in your section 10 then. And if I go to overall position and conclusion 10.57 and 10.58. Overall, the operating levels of the main 4 crematoria and Barnby Dun are forecast to reduce from 109% in a mean month, 135 in peak, to 94 in a mean month and 116 in a peak month. This reaffirms that without the proposed development, scenario 1, there is a clear need for additional crematorium provision, as even in a mean month, the crematorium will operate on average over 100% of factored capacity. The result at 94% is still a high level. There will be particular pressure during peak months. It's a point that I took with you earlier. Would I be right in saying that when I go to your table 10.13, direct cremations are not included within that?
No, direct cremations are assessed in section 9. In section 10, both the proposed development and the existing are based upon all cremations.
Yeah, and then based on all cremations must include direct cremations.
That's correct.
And so 10.13 therefore does not, insofar as there is an impact on mean and peak months, includes direct cremations which should have no impact. Should they?
The diversion of cremations is exactly the same as long as it's on a consistent basis.
Well, that's not good enough. If you go back to your 1020, I think you make it absolutely clear. Just make sure I've got this right. You tell us in terms 1020, final sentence, however, as this section of my evidence is not dealing with need, that's section 10, isn't it? Not dealing with need, it's not necessary to deduct direct cremations from the figures. Right? So if I go to your 1013 again, insofar as you rely upon that in your conclusion as evidence of need, it is not taking into account direct cremations. And in those circumstances, where there is an analysis of impact on mean month or peak month, it's got to be wrong.
If we go back to table 9.14a, that sets out the need position of at 2034. That is my position on need, and that takes into account direct cremations, both for the proposed development and the existing.
Please may I have an answer to my question?
I'm coming on to that. In section 10, I don't deduct direct cremations from either the proposed development or the existing. And so that is consistent because I'm looking at patterns of diversion. Where I think you have a point is that it's the expression of that in relation to factor capacity. So the information is correct, but it shouldn't be expressed as a percentage of factor capacity.
With respect, Mr. Best, the information must be incorrect because direct cremations won't have an impact on your scenario 3, will they? Or even earlier, because they will not become factored into mean month or peak month, because they will take place at other times that will not impact upon capacity issues. The part of the need equation, you're absolutely right to take me back to your section 9 if you're being consistent, but when you're dealing with capacity, that's completely different. That's your section 10. And your capacity analysis is, can we just agree, is flawed. The extent to which we can have a debate about, but it is flawed insofar as it excludes direct cremations.
Capacity and need are the same thing for this purpose. The capacity, the quantitative need is the assessment of the capacity of existing crematoria to operate, and that is my section 9 culminating in the results in table 9.14. Section 10 assesses the trade diversion, and that is a different matter. That's not capacity. That's what happens, what I think will happen in terms of diversions. Will it have an impact on, or what will be the impact on the existing provision? And I've undertaken that on the basis of including direct crematoria. Now, I think that expressing it in terms of factor capacity perhaps isn't the best way of doing it, but ultimately the diversion patterns will be, the proportions will be the same either way.
I don't want to continue this unnecessarily. I gave what I hope was a very robust estimate of my time for cross-examination. Mr. Best, those figures would change in your table 10.3 if you took into account the fact that direct cremations are included within them, and they ought not be if one is considering capacity of these crematoria, the listed crematoria, to meet the qualitative point that you were making.
If we deduct direct cremations from both the proposal and from the existing crematoria, then there will be a like-for-like or a proportionate change in the figures. That doesn't change in absolute terms, but where I've agreed that you have a point is because in table 1013 I've benchmarked it against factor capacity, and that intrinsically implies that you're talking about peaks, core slots. So on the basis that I have forecast direct cremations at 11%, then those percentages are likely to be about 11% high.
Okay.
So based on scenario 1, peak month total 135, that would come down by about 11%. And the same would apply for the others. So
thank you very much.
The conclusion of that would be that all the crematoria would still be operating at over 100% or around 100% in the peak month, even after the trade diversion.
Okay. Can I ask you to turn to your page 67, if you would, paragraph 10.49.
Just before I do that, can I just make one further point? Yeah, the capacity of existing crematoria in figure 10.14a is 116.6%, 117%. So that would be of a similar order to the scenario 1 peak month total if we took 11% off or something like that.
Apologies for interrupting, Mr. Best. What table did you refer to there, just so I can be clear?
9.14a. It has a total capacity at 2034 at a peak month of 116.6%. I apologise. I interrupted you. You were about to take me somewhere else.
No,
sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt again. I was trying to find that table. Can you just remake that point so I'm clear on that, Mr. Best?
Yes. So at table 9.14a, the figure in the bottom right, 116.6% is the overall trading of the existing crematorium in the peak month as a percentage of factor capacity. The figure in table 10.13, which we were looking at for scenario 1, it reads 135.1%. If we took the 11% off, then that would be a figure of approximate level of the 116% from table 9.14a.
they're not really reconcilable. They get closer, I'll be the first to acknowledge that, but they're not reconcilable, are they?
Well, I don't think they ever would be, because one is the table 9.14 is identifying cremations that are actually taking place, whereas table 10.13 relates to the natural catchment areas. So you wouldn't expect them to be the same, but you'd expect them to be similar.
I was going to take you to 1049 on page 67.
Yeah.
I think this is a point that Mr. Village took up with you. The figures that are in 1049, bearing in mind that we've already looked at that first sentence, the figure of 72 cremations diverted from Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham, 72, fewer cremations diverted from Barnby Dun and 144 fewer from Rose Hill. Those are elements of your judgment rather than any sort of empirical modelled analysis that we can examine, aren't they?
They are based on my judgment, correct.
Why, for example, wouldn't it be the case that there would be 172 fewer cremations diverted from Barnby Dun? That's your judgment. You don't rationalise it anywhere in this evidence, do you? Well,
I've explained that I've adopted a figure of 30% for cremations, which would be by means, the location which would be chosen other than by convenience. And so I've essentially divided that into two. So in the western half, I've given the additional cremations, and in the eastern half, I've taken cremations away. And I've kept it simple, and therefore on the western side, there are 3 crematoria, and I've divided that between 3, and in the eastern half, in my judgment, the figure would be 144 for Rose Hill and 72 for Barnby Dun.
And your rationale for that is the improvement to the qualitative offer?
In part, I think ultimately once Barnby Dun is operational. Sorry, we're talking about the qualitative offer on the eastern side, are we?
I'm talking about the reason why you have that 30% diversion across the board in 1049.
Okay, so the 30% is based upon the information from Dignity and Westerly, which we talked about with Mr. Robson. On the western side, the degree of the natural catchment area, those 3 crematoria within a 30-minute drive time of the proposed development is relatively high. Those crematoria will remain overtrading to quite a significant degree based upon the modelling of convenience, scenario 2. The slot length will be better at proposed development, and the waiting times will be less. And it's a combination of those factors.
Right. I hope you were present during the cross-examination of Mr. Lathbury yesterday by me.
I was.
Yeah. I took him to the CMA document E2. Happy to take you to it again. But the point that you make is unsupported by their findings, isn't it?
Well, as I referred to earlier to Mr. Robson, the CMA document is based upon a national picture, but we have to take into account local circumstances of this area. There haven't been any new crematoria in the Western Arc for 60 years, and that's an unusual situation. And in in that situation, I think it's likely that there will be a greater transfer to the proposed development than there might be where there is a newer and greater provision of crematoria that's taken place over that last 60 years. I also think that the proximity of the proposed development is important here. One of the paragraphs you took me to earlier in the CMA report referred to the fact that very few people have a choice of more than one crematoria, and therefore it is hardly surprising that they choose based upon that consideration alone. But in this situation, the distances will be closer, and therefore, given the operating characteristics of the Western Arc against the proposed development and the shorter distances, I think that a greater proportion of people will transfer to the proposed development than might be the case based upon national considerations.
Right, well, ma'am, I'm going to deal with this in my closing. I'm not accepting that as a proposition. You will make what you will of the CMA report. I want to go then behind the figure of 30%. That's the Westerly document, is it not, that you're relying upon in the main, that showed 20 to 30%?
It's a combination of the Westerly document and the Dignity. The information that was submitted to the CMA by both Dignity and Westerly. Dignity said in excess of 30%, and Westerly said between 20 and 30%.
Right, and you actually reproduced, do you not, in your appendix to your main proof, the Westerly document that you rely upon?
I produce a Westerly survey, and that contains information, and in part I do rely on the Westerly information.
Yeah. I'd like to see the source of the 30%. Can I ask you to direct me and the inspector and the inquiry to it, please?
It's based upon the information that's in the CMA report, which I think is quoted again by Mr. Mitchell as well. I haven't put that source information in.
Well, can you take me to the CMA report that discusses the 30%? Because my understanding of the CMA report is that I don't think it's discussed in quite those terms, 20 to 30%, but whatever it is, it's rejected.
The CMA's report on the national picture didn't accept the submissions of, as you pointed out to Mr. Lathbury yesterday, Memoria, Dignity and Westerly. Nonetheless, information was put forward by Dignity and Westerly to the CMA, and those are the figures, and they're broadly at 30%. I've explained to you that, in my opinion, in the local circumstances, 30% is appropriate. I remain of that view, and that's why I've used it.
It's an obvious point. The CMA report, having been provided with that evidence, rejects it. And it rejects it not on the basis that there may be local circumstances where this will not be of application, but says in terms, the main driver for the choice of crematoria is location, not quality of offer. Your evidence flies in the face of that clear finding, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. My evidence is based on a staged approach, and scenario 2 is based upon convenience. That assumes 100% of people choose based upon convenience alone. The CMA recognises that there are other considerations. It's saying that most people choose based upon convenience, but not everybody. And I have taken stage 3 on the basis that it's 30% in this particular location.
And you do so in circumstances where the CMA report says it works both ways.
As I explained,
a brand new state-of-the-art facility, appropriately designed and attractive for the operator's point of view, and they may still choose to go to a more historic crematory for all sorts of other reasons. Set in terms both ways.
Clearly, people choose crematoria for a variety of reasons, and as I explained to Mr. Robson, of the reasons set out in my appendices from the Westerly survey, some of those you can take into account and some you can't. And things like reputation or family history, you can't model, and I, like everybody else, have assumed that's neutral. But in my scenario 3, I have taken into account considerations which has been found in survey evidence to be important to some people, and I've applied that to the local circumstances here. Clearly, given the proximity of Brodsworth to the Western Arc, there will be people who will have additional choice within a 30-minute area. And whilst I still expect most people to exercise that choice on the basis of convenience, and remember, in applying 30%, that means 70% of people, the majority of people, will still choose based upon convenience. I forecast that a proportion of people will choose for other reasons.
Right. Can I ask you to go to core document H19, the Wheating decision? There's one issue that I want to take up with you. It concerns consistency of approach.
I think I have it. Yes, I've got it.
And just to be clear, you gave evidence, in fact, broadly the same team that gave evidence, different representation, as this appeal, the exception of Mr. Humphrey.
I did give evidence.
Yeah. And it postdates both the inquiry and the decision letter, postdates Worgs and the CMA report.
That's correct.
Can I ask you to go to paragraph 18? It's under the section that begins at paragraph 12 dealing with need.
Yes.
At paragraph 18, and I assume that this was the case put by dignity that's being recorded by the inspector, in addition to capacity, the need for crematoria is also driven by proximity. Almost all of the area around the appeal site lies outside a 30-minute Cortege drive time, equivalent to about 18 minutes normal drive time of any existing crematoria. The proposed development would bring a population of between 61 and 63,000 within the 30-minute Cortege drive time of a crematoria for the first time. In addition to driving by motorcar, the site would also be within walking distance of a train station, etc. Sustainability points, no doubt. Was that part of the case that was being put by dignity at that time, earlier this year?
The case, the circumstances of Wheating were very different from the proposed development here, in the sense that once you plotted the 30-minute drive time areas, you had a big gap in provision where people within that area had to drive more than 30 minutes. And that effectively, you could fit 2 crematoria on a 30-minute drive time within that area. And we were on the eastern side of that. So the need case there was based upon it being a rural location within which a high proportion of the population and deaths would be as a newly served area.
Mr. Best, I think my question was a little more precise. Did you put, as part of the need case and as a material consideration of weight to be considered by the inspector in this case, that there would be a cohort of people who would have a crematoria available to them within a 30-minute drive time for the first time?
Yes, although I can't recall whether that was presented in terms of population and deaths or just deaths by me. There was agreement with the council's witness on the basic facts, and that's why actually I think I must have done, because I think that's why there's a range. I can't remember which way round it is, but the one of us quoted 61,000, one of us quoted 63,000. So yes, I did.
And we know in this case, Mr. Hodgson has done the exercise, I believe you have, and the figures are not materially different. There are about 22,000 or thereabouts that would fall within that consideration. New people that would have for the first time, within 30 minutes Cortege drive time, a crematory available to them.
That's correct. Well, it's correct that Mr. Hodgson has provided the information. I haven't. The case at Weeting filled a gap in provision, but it didn't have such a significant relieving effect. So that was where the need arose in that particular case. In this particular case, the numbers of people who would be newly served are relatively small, and the approach is all about the relief that the scheme will provide to the Western Arc.
I do actually think somewhere you do provide a figure, and I don't think it's materially different. I'll try and locate it, but I don't want to interrupt my cross-examination or be discourteous to you, Mr. Best. I think we've had enough about GIS systems. Mr. Hodgson's explained that position. As I understand it, looking at your rebuttal, you don't suggest for 1 minute that the map info information is inappropriate or carries less weight for any reason in the assessment that's been undertaken by Mr. Hodgson.
No, I don't criticise map info equally. I think that the GIS system that we used, it's a reputable company, as I think Mr. Hodgson accepted. It was selected by Montague Evans on the basis that it fulfills provides the data for a wide variety of land uses, and it's been accepted by numerous clients since we obtained it. The drive time areas that it produces were tested by the use in the other platforms that are set out in our rebuttal.
Yeah, all of which will change on a day-by-day basis because the AA keeps making changes because of traffic jams, accidents and the like.
Well, let's be clear. The GIS system is based upon national speed limits and its understanding of likely traffic conditions at a time and day that you set. So we set Monday 11 o'clock on the basis that it was outside peak travel times and within 4 slots for a crematorium. And the catchment plans that are produced are based upon that. We haven't manipulated that, but we did use other platforms to test it, and they show that Pontefract, Barnsley and Rotherham are consistent with the 30-minute area that the drive time areas show.
Now, I want you to turn to Mr. Hodgson's evidence, page 7, if you would, page 7. Map 1.1 and 2.2.
Yes.
The assessment that is then conducted of the minimum distance catchment, I didn't understand to be challenged as a matter of mathematics or calculation, because no doubt you've been able to do that. Check his, with apologies to Mr. Robson, the workings out of Mr. Hodgson you've been able to check. He has produced a minimum distance catchment of about 120,000. Is that something that you can confirm on the basis of Mr. Hodgson's exercise?
Mr. Hodgson says somewhere in his evidence, so I'm not quite sure where, but he does say 120,000. That's or thereabouts. Is it a figure I recall?
Yeah. I'm conscious that I'm pressing my luck in terms of the time estimate that I gave him, so I'm trying to do it as succinctly as I can. If you go then to the next page, page 8.
Well, there we go. That's got it on there. The table, the top table, proposed Brodsworth appeal site.
Yeah.
Based upon Mr. Hodgson's platform, 120,000.
I don't know anybody else that's put a figure forward. So insofar as the inspector may consider that a relevant consideration, she has got it on an unchallenged basis, as I understand it.
Well, I think I did put a figure of 140,000 in my evidence, 142,000, paragraph 5.12.
Thank you for that. I'm no doubt make a note of that. In terms of the impact, 3.8 and the table that follows it, the change in the catchment across the Western Arc crematoria is very modest, isn't it? Doesn't achieve 10%.
Based upon these figures, that's correct.